Today on the Lowdown, a Down syndrome podcast, Dr. Susan Fawcett and Adrienne Dall'Antonia gives us a lowdown on what to do when your child's imagination gets carried away. Over to you, Hannah Marla.
Thanks, Danielle. Hello, and welcome to The Lowdown. I'm your host, Marla Folden, an SLP here at the DSRF, and I'm joined by my co-host, Hannah Mahmood, who's an OT at the DSRF as well. On today's episode, we're discussing fantasy, imagination, and the kind of areas in between. Families might feel really familiar with this area. We're talking about self-talk and movies and pretending and more. We will be joined today by a family who has very extensive experience in this area, as well as Dr. Susan Fawcett to guide our conversation. We've wanted to make this episode for a very long time since it comes up so frequently in the later school years and beyond.
Yeah, so let's kind of introduce you to our guests today. So Dr. Susan Fawcett, who's appeared on our podcast a few times before, is the Director of Therapy, Behavior, and Family Services at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation. As part of completing her doctoral degree with Dr. Joe Lucician in the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology and Special Education in 2020, Dr. Fawcett completed a dissertation project evaluating a preventative parent training program for families of young children with Down syndrome who exhibit mild to moderate problem behavior. During her schooling, Susan also completed a 2-year practicum with a clinical psychologist at the Vancouver CBT Center, where she learned how to provide cognitive behavioral therapy techniques to adolescents and adults with developmental disabilities and mental health diagnoses such as depression and anxiety. And also joining us today is a wonderful parent. Her name is Adrienne Dall'Antonia. She is a sibling of 7, a mother of 3, and a wife of 1. Her academic background is a business degree from Simon Fraser University and a science or dietetics degree from the University of British Columbia. She practiced as a consulting registered dietitian for over 20 years with Eating for Energy. She switched positions in 2020 and is now a caretaker of her live-in 88-year-old mother-in-law, Anna, and her 25-year-old daughter, Alia. The other household members include her husband, Roger, daughter, Leanna, her boyfriend, Lachlan, and 20-year-old son, Noah, as well as 2 cats and 1 dog. Alia had previously been diagnosed with Down syndrome, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and anxiety. And her latest challenges started just as they were starting to feel the effects of COVID-19. It is this most recent journey that she is here to talk to us about today. So welcome to the Lowdown podcast, Adrienne and Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us here.
Yeah, we're looking forward to kind of delving into this topic. But before we get into it, in the grand tradition of the Lowdown podcast, we always like to ask our guests 5 secret questions. So I was hoping you guys be game for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Susan knows the drill, so that's great. So you're ready. Okay, Adrienne, why don't we start with you first? What sport would you compete in if you were in the Olympics? So summer or winter?
No skills required.
No
Just
skills
whatever you
required.
want to be in.
Yeah.
That's a tricky one. Probably the luge.
Ooh, yeah.
For the thrills.
Yeah.
Thrills.
Yeah.
Go
Thrills.
fast. Great. What about you, Susan?
Oh, I'd have to go with gymnastics because it's the only thing that I would have a remote possibility of being able to do.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. And even then it would be not good.
Oh, I'm an expert luger.
Okay.
Oh, there we
Great.
go.
Well, then there we go. Okay, question number 2. What is your favorite breakfast food, Adrienne?
Oh, I just went to Yolks
Yeah.
and had like an amazing Benny, which is not my normal favorite, but it was so delicious.
Yeah.
That I'd have to say that just because that's the most recent thing in my repertoire.
Love a good Eggs Benedict. What about you, Susan?
I also love a good Eggs Benedict.
okay.
But I think if I had to pick like a sweet one, I would also pick waffles. Like really good waffles.
Okay.
Not mediocre waffles.
No, mediocre
No
waffles are
pedestrian
not good.
waffles. Yeah.
No.
So no Lego your ego. You're
No,
like, no, make me a
absolutely
proper
not.
waffle.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Question number 3. So as we're moving back to a more of a normalcy in our lives, and hopefully COVID-19 is slowly going away, what is the first place that you would like to go on vacation if there was no restrictions, nothing?
I know the answer to this question because yesterday we dropped my son off at the airport, and he flew to Ireland to study abroad for 8 months. So we are planning to go to meet him in Ireland, and then hopefully go to Wales, maybe Scotland. So my last name used to be Thomas, so I've got a Welsh background, and excited to do some riding and visiting over there.
That sounds lovely.
Mm-hmm.
Susan, what about you?
That really does sound lovely. I think though right now I'm kind of hooked on the idea of going to Spain and Italy. And we're hoping to do that next year.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great.
There's a lot to look forward to now. Finally.
There really is.
I really am hoping, yeah.
Oh.
It's hopefully it's taking a turn. Okay, Marla's going to handle the next couple.
For sure. Next question is, does your summer this year have a soundtrack that goes along with it perfectly? Is there a song that fits your summer?
Yeah.
We can start with you.
I have been listening to 2 bands recently, which are kind of new. One was I heard about from Lachlan, Leanna's boyfriend. He's Australian, and he really likes a band called Lime Cordiale.
Okay.
And I love them. So that's number 1. The second band that I just started listening to, actually, I don't know if they're a band or just a guy, but Orville Peck, who
Canadian.
my brother got me into him, and I think he's pretty unique.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he is very unique.
I have to go with what's stuck in my head right now, which is everything we listened to in the Raise Me Up program last week. So it was all, pump up music.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of Lizzo, which I wasn't
go
super
wrong.
sold on Lizzo. And then they were really getting me into her.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I feel like I'm kind of changing my mind on her a little bit.
coming
Yeah.
around on
What do you mean it wasn't
Very-
badonkadonk?
Well, I mean, there was that as
Honky
well.
tonk,
There was
badonkadonk.
Honky Tonk Badonkadonk. That was one of the pump up songs, contributed by Alia.
Yeah.
Miss Alia.
But yes, there were some good choices in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Raise Me Up program that you're referring to, do you want to just give our listeners a quick little thing about it, just so that they understand why the pump up song was such an important
so
part?
it's a mix of Andrea Lee and I teach it together, and we get very excited every year to teach it because she kind of, as the comprehensive sexual health educator, contributes the relationship piece and how to have healthy relationships. And then me being more the behavior mental health person, I talk a lot about, in that program about self-esteem and self-confidence.
Great. So pump up songs.
Pump up songs are necessary.
Love it.
Necessary. And there was a lot of good dance moves. Lots.
And Alia loved it, and she's very resistant to coming to programs right now.
so good to
So
hear. Yeah.
she loved it. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Let's talk about Miss Alia, if you don't mind. Can you tell us a little bit about her, kind of set the stage for what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. So Alia is 25 and was quite well adjusted and had quite a routine prior to the onset of COVID. So she went to SFU, studied there with the Steps Forward program, and was enjoying a variety of different classes. She was attending classes like all the other kids and enjoying university life. And she had a part-time job, so she was working 1 day a week, and that was going really well. That was at a coffee roastery, and lovely people. It's Mogiana, if I can give them a plug. They certainly deserve it. So everything was going pretty well, not too many bumps in the road. she does have ADHD, so she was on medication for that. And then COVID hit and things changed, of course, for everyone. And our house became, I think, just there was too much fear, so much fear. We had the news on all the time. We'd be getting Twitter feeds and just too much information and too much negativity, and everybody was scared to go out, and even with masks it was scary. The vaccines weren't available yet. It was just very troubling. And then SFU went online. Alia was not interested in Zoom. She's not a fan of Zoom, so that didn't work out so well for her. She basically dropped out of that. Steps Forward, the people there were wonderful and kept trying to keep her engaged, but even then, she was becoming more and more isolating of herself and her actions. My mom set up a weekly meeting of writing because Alia used to love writing. She'd write songs, she'd write stories, writes just ideas and lists. She was very much into art, so she would always do that. If she wasn't writing, she would do some kind of art, painting, drawing, tracing, anything, painting rocks, whatever. For her, really creative. Loved music, loved watching various TV shows with myself and her father. And then she just became more and more isolated, and she would choose to spend time in her room, more and more time in her room. And it happened so gradually. We didn't really realize what was happening until I kind of knew that something was off. And then her employer actually called me and said, Alia's doing a lot of daydreaming. She's not engaged in what she's supposed to do. We love having her here and we'll continue to have her here, but she's not doing the functions that she's supposed to do, or she's taking a really, really long time doing it. So that was a big reality check. And so I took her to the doctor. And at this point, she was still I was able to get her to appointments because that stopped shortly after. So the doctor, said I had done some Google doctor Google, and had found the term maladaptive daydreaming, because that's what she was doing. She was just daydreaming in her room for hours and hours and hours. And the doctor said, well, this is just the family doctor. And she said, it sounds like it's actually really adaptive, and that she's able to get away from these negative thoughts and experiences by daydreaming and immersing herself in a fantasy world. And I thought, yes, but the amount that she's doing it and at what cost to her usual experience and social life. So I wasn't really happy with that answer. And my doctor, or Alia's doctor, did agree to talk to the people at the Burnaby Developmental Disabilities Mental Health Services. They have psychiatrists and psychiatric nurses there. So my doctor said she would reach out and ask some questions. And she did put her on an anti-anxiolytic medication, an SSRI, which didn't work. And we realized quite quickly that it wasn't helping. So we stopped that. And then things got progressively worse. And she wasn't sleeping. She would daydream into the wee hours. At one point, my husband went into her room and said, Alia, you're awake. It's 6 o'clock. And Alia said, oh, good, it's dinner time. And he said, no, it's 6 o'clock in the morning. And she'd been daydreaming all night. So just no sense of time. She would have baths that would last 3 to 5 hours. We couldn't get her out, like just could not. And she would get very angry when we wanted to get her out of her room. She would prefer to eat in her room, although we insisted that most of the time that she come out and eat. And everything that she used to enjoy doing, she stopped walking. She used to walk every single day. She stopped walking. She stopped doing any art or anything creative. She stopped writing. She stopped watching shows. She stopped going on her phone. There was nothing but her fantasy world. And
Can I ask you a few more questions about it? Just so that it's clear for the people that are listening. I'm wondering things around, like, did she remember to eat if it was put in front of her? Or did you have to sit with her and remind her that she had to eat? Like, if she got started on an activity, could she continue it, or would she kind of drift back into fantasy?
She would be resistant to basically any activity except for eating. And she would eat really, really quickly just to get it over with.
Okay.
And if we suggested doing anything, she would basically refuse. So she wouldn't go to the dentist. She wouldn't even go and visit my mom, which she usually loves to do. So we have to cancel plans very last minute because she'd say she's doing it and then would not.
Nothing could compete with
her daydream was just
that was the top priority.
Too enticing. It would just lure her into this world. And she would also exhibit things like repetitive movements, and she would touch her lips over and over with her hand. And she had some vocalizations that she would say over and over again. And I guess the next step was we finally got to see the psychiatrist. And that was only after the psychiatric nurse with Burnaby Developmental Disabilities mental health team came over, and they were wonderful. They came over and did visits at home, and she had seen Ali a couple of times and realized after 4 or 5 visits that it was getting worse. It was just getting worse. And Ali would pace around, and she'd just pace and talk and not be able to answer questions and really be in her own world. And it was very, very hard to draw her out of that world. There was no laughter. Sometimes she would cry because of what she was going through in her world. I'd say no laughter, but sometimes there was fun things that would happen in that world that she would, but it was not a real laugh. And then we, at one point we said, so I'm going back a little bit because this was right before her appointment with the psychiatrist. So right before, 3 days before the appointment that we knew we had, she was exhibiting such alarming behavior that Roger, her dad, and I said, we can't watch this. We have to get her to the hospital. This is too much. Who knows where this is going to lead. So we asked her if she would go with us to the hospital, and she said yes. And then she went to her room and refused to move. So we called 911 because we told her we would do that. And so the RCMP actually came and declared her, they arrested her. They had to arrest her and declare her unsafe for herself and others. So that was such a huge ordeal. Oh my goodness. At that point she was 88 pounds and she was being restrained by these huge people, and she's strong, so strong. She did not want to go, and just very unhappy with the situation. I would tell you the words that she used, but this is probably a family podcast,
Yeah.
so I won't tell you, but she was not happy. So anyways, the result of that is she was admitted to the RCH mental health facility for 9 days. And so our first appointment with a psychiatrist was without Alia because she was in the hospital. So we explained the situation and we showed some videos. And I'm realizing that this is a very long story. So I
think this is really good.
I apologize. But then, so after that, she got diagnosed with about 4 or 5 different things.
Yeah.
So she was, she was psychotic. She had bipolar disorder. She was, what else did she have? She had anxiety.
Depression was
She
in the
had
mix, too.
depression. She had OCD. I mean, there was just everything flying around.
Yeah.
And it seemed like different psychiatrists in the hospital and the one that we saw at DDMH, they seemed to have a different diagnosis.
Yeah.
So it was really confusing. And we're really like, we don't really care what her diagnosis is.
Can
we
we
just
just
want to
fix
get
this?
her back.
Yeah.
We just want to.
And I think that all the things that are happening, it could be any of those things, 'cause all those symptoms are so overlapping. So every psychiatrist is probably seeing OCD, but then another person is seeing it as anxiety.
Yeah.
So they're just putting all these labels on you, which could not have been easy to hear, that it could be a multitude of things.
And
As a
then,
family,
then you, at some point you just kind of say, okay, you can diagnose her with whatever works for you, but let's figure out how to get her. Let's have a plan of how to get her back. So it was during this time that I was really revisiting the maladaptive daydreaming disorder, and I did reach out to the doctor. His name is, excuse me if I don't say it right, but it's Dr. Eli or Eli Summer.
I think it's Ellie.
Ellie, yeah. And he's a doctor in professor of clinical psychology, and he resides in Israel. And he coined the term maladaptive daydreaming. And I do have a definition, if it's okay if I read it.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
So maladaptive daydreaming disorder is defined as compulsively, addictively engaging in extensive fantasy activity that replaces human interaction and or interferes with academic, interpersonal, or vocational functioning. And to me, that just hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what she was going through. Roger was saying, "Oh, Adrienne, watch your Dr. Google diagnosis, and these are professionals." And but I knew that there was some dissociation going on, and that she was deliberately detaching from reality and her surroundings. So when we talked to the psychiatrist, he did say, yeah, after seeing her, because he eventually did see her, and talking to her and trying to engage with her, he said, yeah, definitely there's a level of dissociation. He was really reluctant to say whether it was a behavioral issue or a psychosis. So we basically treated both.
Yeah.
And to this day, I don't know. I think a combination of both is working. So she went on some antipsychotic medication that was she had in the hospital. She started in the hospital, which caused her to gain probably close to 30 pounds. So, and she's stayed that weight. We have changed the medications, so it's not risperidone, it's aripiprazole, which is Abilify. One of the medications that's discussed when you look at the information on maladaptive daydreaming disorder is SSRIs. And I think fluvoxetine or something like that is one of the most successful. But with Alia, they said she doesn't have a good history with SSRIs, which is an anti-anxiety medication. So they said, try, keep on with the, so she was taking Ativan to get her sleep schedule better and the Abilify for the antipsychotic. And then a huge component at the same time was behavioral therapy. So Susan would come over once a week. Was it once a week? Yeah. Come to the house, which was absolutely amazing because we could not get Alia out of the house for a very long time. And she would come once a week and first work with myself and Alia, and then it became mostly just Alia. And at that time, we also had some art therapy, which there was a art therapist who came to our house just to have her have something to do. And that was scheduled. And then gradually, very gradually, we were able to introduce more things, and we learned triggers. So music for a long time was a trigger. So she loves music. And first of all, she wouldn't even listen to music. And then when she started listening to it, she would like it for the first bit and maybe sing a little bit along with the music. And then it would trigger her into her fantasy world. So she was gone. And then, so I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because music to me is usually a great thing. But if it's causing you to lose yourself in your fantasy world, then that's not great. And I'm just going to interrupt myself here just to talk a bit about her fantasy world, because it's kind of interesting. Her world that she's chosen or built for herself is based on the Vampire Diaries. So this was a show that she used to love watching, and she would watch the Vampire Diaries and then the spin-off called, I think it's The Originals. Yeah, The Originals. And she was particularly fond of one of the characters called Elijah. So she didn't like the way that the story, the plot ended on TV. So she decided to make herself a character in a version of the Vampire Diaries that involved herself, but she was a character called Rachel, and also Nicole, which is confusing, but they're doppelgangers, which is more confusing. But anyways, that's the way she had it. And Elijah was her, I'm not quite sure if he was her brother or her lover, but maybe sometimes at different times, one of each. I don't know. So she's got a huge, incredibly complex plot going on in her head. So I think at the beginning it was like, don't talk to me. I've got to keep this plot straight in my head. So she would go over and over and over it. And she wouldn't usually talk to me about it. I was able to get little bits and pieces of it. We were able to, like, her cousin came over one time and she said, "What does Rachel look like?" And she described Rachel, and her cousin, who was 11, drew her. And Ali's like, "Yep, you got it right on." Like the dark curly hair and it didn't look like Alia. So that was kind of interesting. And then as we are starting to come out of it, we are now at the point, after many, many sessions with Susan, and Dr. Fawcett can tell you more about her experiences with Alia, because it was, we see her every day. So it's hard for us to see the change along the way. And when we reflect back, we realize how far she's come. But now she's able to listen to music and sing along. Roger was saying after he dropped her off here at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation to see Susan, on the ride home, they were singing songs, and she was actually singing along to every word. Just like anyone would. So
I was just wanted to reflect a little bit on the complexity of the fantasy she went into and the story that she created, like it sounds exhausting. Like what was she like in terms of her energy level and her fatigue? Because it's a lot for your brain to constantly be keeping up with this, right?
That's a really good point, because I've never really thought of it like that, but she was exhausted all the time. Like it was really tiring. She had no energy for like walking, this at the beginning, for walking or any kind of activity at all. We said one of the things that said she would commit to was tap dancing. So we tried doing that, and she did. I thought, okay, great. I can leave her for an hour and she can do some tap dancing and that'll be good for her. Well, she decided that mom had to be there with her. So mom and mom's friend Kim learned how to tap dance with Alia. So that was actually really fun. It was funny. And yeah, so now she's into the music. We'll watch a show. My friend Kim has been really great with Alia, and she said, let's just go to a movie. Let's go. And Alia loves movies. And that was something she used to love to do. So the three of us go, and we go in Brentwood where it's got beautiful heated seats and you can order margaritas and popcorn and have a really good time there. So we've done that a couple of times, and that's been really positive. And yeah, there's some funny stories there, which I won't get into, but Alia I'll tell you one story. She decided that Dune was really boring. So she left halfway through Dune, she maybe made it 3/4 of the way. And she went into the bar at the movie theater and ordered herself a margarita.
Great.
Yeah. No money.
Oh, okay.
She just ordered, and so I came to find her and I said, Alia, this is not an all-inclusive.
Yeah.
And she's just like, I'm using my Down syndrome card, which she says quite often. So she uses this Down. I'm like, I think I actually have to get a card made. That is the Down syndrome card. So it ended up she
Down
got
syndrome privilege.
Yeah,
Love it.
She got the waitress was just so lovely. So she got her margaritas for free, which was and like alcohol and everything. I'm like, seriously. Anyway, So she's, her character is coming back, because as Susan will tell you, she's a bit of a naughty, sly one. And so she's able to work. She's got another job. So she's got 3 days a week. She's working at something. So one day is the roastery, Mogiana, another plug. And the other one is Vancouver Props and Costumes, which they've been really wonderful. So she got on with a employment consultant through CIBC, and after some work with Tyler there, she's got that position, and she can walk from her house to the job, and it's a really good fit. So she's laughing more. She's dancing more. She's watching shows, and we're trying to work on scheduling her times where she's daydreaming, because she still wants to daydream. And we'll talk about like I can interrupt her when she's daydreaming.
Yeah,
and
making it more adaptive.
Yeah, and she's able to come out of her daydream. And if she starts rocking or doing any of those kinds of repetitive behaviors, we'll say, Alia, what are you doing? And she's like, oh, sorry. Yeah. And she'll realize what she's doing. And we went to the P&E, and she had a really, really good time. And I said, I wonder if you could put Elijah in a box or something. Just leave him at home. And she said, well, I'm not sure if I can do that, but I'll try. So there's,
Wow.
So, and Susan can maybe tell you more about their one conversation, which I thought was so wonderful, was why, like, how do you choose somebody to be friends with or have a relationship with? And that was really funny.
Yeah.
The first thing that comes into my mind, and I think it's an important one. Susan, could you talk a little bit about how maladaptive daydreaming is not the same as DSRD? Because it sounds
Or
on
just
some levels
yeah.
similar. And we have several episodes in this season about that.
Yeah.
So Alia maintains a lot of her self-care skills. Like,
That's
she was
right.
still able to eat if you put it there. She kept her ability to do toileting and some of those things.
She did not, for quite a while, she did not want to wash.
She didn't want to wash.
Yeah, so it was either a 5-hour bath or no bathing for like a week and a half or something.
Yeah, I agree. It would be nice to kind of separate maladaptive daydreaming or distinguish with DSGRD, and then just maybe even just fantasy, like general fantasies that a lot of our students might engage in that is not maladaptive.
Sure. Yeah. So, and I mean, the maladaptive daydreaming is, you know, as Adrienne said, it was not one of the diagnoses for Alia that was thrown out there. And probably one of the main reasons for that is it's not really an official diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is what all psychiatrists will use. So I imagine it will be at some point because there's now quite a bit of research to support that it's a phenomenon, at least in the population of typically developing adults. So it's a bit of a newer construct and not really deemed a disorder yet, but it really is just that component, right? It's that the person is spending, you know, more than half their time, their waking hours, in some kind of dream world, and that dream world, as Adrienne said, is preferable to their real life, right? So that's kind of the main piece. And I mean, there's other things too, like the repetitive movements and things like that go along with the maladaptive daydreaming. But the Down syndrome disintegrative disorder or Down syndrome regression disorder, I never know what to call it these days because it's called both, is a much more... there's a lot more to it. So the regression piece in particular is essentially that the person loses a lot of skills that they had previously achieved. So and it's also very rare, right? It's actually quite common for for people with Down syndrome to engage in a lot of fantasy, whether it's at the level of the maladaptive daydreaming, maybe not so much all the time, but in the regression disorder, certainly there's a lot more happening, you know, or not happening really, because they've, you know, lost the ability to use the bathroom. They're not able to, you know, do a lot of
or talk, and some of
a lot of them lose communication skills. They lose cognitive skills. I think, you know, in Alia's case, like academic skills probably slipped for a while because she was engaging more in the daydreaming, but it's not like they were gone. They were just
put on the back burner.
They were on the back burner. They didn't compete with, even though she's always enjoyed writing her whole life, she wasn't doing it because she was too engrossed in the fantasy world. So it's kind of like that piece of it might be, the daydreaming might be part of the regression disorder, but it's certainly not the major component of it. That's for sure. Yeah.
And our family doctor, did suggest that indeed might be happening. And at one point she said, Adrienne, you might just have to come to the point where you accept that this is who Alia is. And the Alia that you knew before is not going to come back, which made me very angry, very frustrated, very disappointed, and made me take action even more. So if you're a family doctor, don't say that.
Yeah, definitely don't jump to the worst case scenario right away. Holy smokes. Yeah. And I will say though, when I first, you know, having known Alia for a very long time, because I've known her since she was a preschooler, you know, and I hadn't seen her in a few years really, or interacted with her much in a few years. And when I first saw her last summer, she was not the Alia that I remembered. And I was really worried. You know, I was like, whoa, this is, and so that did pop into my mind, except then it didn't, because I knew that she hadn't lost all these skills, right? So once I, you know, talked to Adrienne a bit more about it. So But it was definitely a very different human being for sure. Yeah.
So I'm sure people that are listening to this are like, okay, I need to kind of have my radar on. What should I look for so that I know that this is happening? Obviously, COVID, would you say, Adrienne, that it was like probably a huge trigger?
I think it was
the only trigger.
It was a major trigger. Yeah. And then her grandfather, her nono, passed away as well, which I'm sure did not help, because then everybody's sad and down, and a house is not a happy place to be.
Of course. Yeah. So then, is pretending through fantasies and imagination always problematic? Like, what should we look for? So life stressors are one thing. What are some of the other things that we should be looking for that kind of gets our radars up, just to kind of make sure that we have all of our T's crossed and our I's dotted? Like, what would you recommend families look for?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say just the decrease in engaging in activities that are previously enjoyed. So it became very obvious quite quickly when she stopped walking, stopped writing, stopped watching TV, stopped using her phone, stopped doing any creative activity at all. Literally not wanting to talk to anybody on the phone, not wanting to talk to anybody in the house.
Yeah.
She was wanting to be in her fantasy world as much of the time possible. So if there's any major decrease, loss of interest in things that are previously enjoyed, that would be definitely a trigger or a reason to be concerned.
And I think too, something you just said, Hina, about like, is it always a problem? We should talk about that, because it's not. I mean, all of us engage in some fantasy, right? Like it is a very normal thing to do as a human being. You know, kids all pass through a stage where they are really doing a lot of pretend play. And in fact, we worry about kids here when they aren't doing that, right? And kids who aren't engaging in pretend play are usually not, they've got, you know, maybe their cognitive skills are lower. Maybe there's another diagnosis at play like autism. So, you know, we definitely want to see some pretend and some fantasy, and we need it for creativity and problem solving, and we need it to develop big ideas, and it's a really important thing. It's just when it gets too much, right? That's when it's a problem. But I think there are, Adrienne already mentioned, you know, life stressors, such as, especially in Alia's case, you know, there was a death in the family. I think too, you also mentioned that Leanna and Noah, her siblings, their friends weren't around as much.
Oh, absolutely. Our house dynamic changed a lot, because my two other kids are really, really social, and they have a lot of friends coming around the house, and the friends interact with Alia. And there's none of that, at least for quite a while.
Yeah.
And that made a huge difference. And she's got one best friend who's typical, and she wouldn't communicate with her even on the phone.
Yeah.
And so it was.
Yeah, so there can definitely be those things for sure. There can be kind of acute life stressors or things that are happening currently. I think there's other triggers too that cause kids to veer more into that fantasy world. Like I think sometimes it's just boredom, and certainly that was at play during the pandemic, right? Because all of these things were taken away, and now, you know, you're at home with just mom and dad, and I mean, they can be somewhat entertaining, but they're not going to be able to entertain you for too long if you're a teenager. So definitely the inability to connect meaningfully with other peers, right? In a school scenario, for example, that happens with a lot of our teens with Down syndrome. Sometimes you add in the layer of social anxiety, right? Kids who are quite anxious about being around other people or where it's difficult for them, and just that general kind of escapism. You know, like if I'm a person with Down syndrome and I go into a fantasy world, well, guess what? There I can look like whatever I want to look like. I don't have to have Down syndrome. I can be capable of so much more there, right? And I think it was Dennis McGuire who said, he's a psychologist who actually is a social worker who wrote the book on the mental wellness in adults with Down syndrome, and has worked with people with Down syndrome for like 30 years. But he always says that, you know, the reason why they engage in so much fantasy, or one of the reasons why, is because they have such rich visual imagery compared to their other cognitive abilities. So it's easy for them to kind of get, you know, into that world and like really develop something very complex, like what Alia did. And I think too, the cognitive level plays into it. Like somebody like Alia, who obviously had very strong cognitive and language skills, you know, prior to veering too much into the fantasy world, it sort of didn't help in a way, because she was able to develop such a complex scene in her mind, right? So there's a lot of reasons why some of the teens and adults might kind of veer into that realm.
I think I agree with you about the boredom, and that's what we're dealing with now. She will, I will ask her if she's in her room, like she'll come back from work and she'll go into her room, lie flat on her bed, and she'll be dreaming, doing her fantasy thing, and she just lies there. And I'll say, Alia, are you daydreaming right now? And she'd be like, maybe. And I'm like, do you want to do something else? Are you bored? Yeah, I'm bored. And then I'll give her a list of things to do. So it's a lot of work and a lot of time. I'm really, really lucky that I've basically retired and I'm a caregiver now. Really, really fortunate that we're in that kind of situation where I can dedicate my time to her and my mother-in-law, because I'll have to be the one to, do you want to play Uno? Do you want to play? We got a ping pong table because we thought she'd like a ping pong table. Do you want to go for a walk? Do you want to? And Susan's been great about creating this long list of things that Alia might be interested in, and I mean, some of them are hilarious, like fart under the covers, because right now she's going through this body sound stage where she thinks burping and farting are like the most hysterical things in the world. So, but whatever it takes, it takes is fine. So boredom is a big factor. So we're trying to, and she's starting to realize that she can do things herself. But I'm a little bit sneaky, and I'll do things like I'll go on her phone and start a conversation with somebody. This morning I did one with Sadie. I start, hi, how you doing? What are you doing today? And then leave it to Alia to finish it. Oh, and she doesn't. I don't think she knows what's. Alia doesn't know what's sneaky, going on.
But a very good idea.
Yeah. And I'll do that with her. Her CLBC helpers too. I'll start something because they don't really want the mom involved, but sometimes Alia doesn't go on her phone. And today I added her on WhatsApp because her brother is in Ireland. So now we'll have a family communication there. And so she can decide whether she wants to engage or not. But
and I think you bring up a very important point that for anybody, whether you have Down syndrome or not, if you don't have things to do throughout your day, it's not good for anybody, right? So, I mean, there's so much research out there that for a lot of people suffering from mental health challenges, if they don't have things to occupy time in their day, then the mental health stuff takes over. So if you have schizophrenia, then the symptoms get worse because you're always just focusing on that and not something else. So I'm glad that you mentioned that you're slowly adding things to Alia's schedule so that she can, it's not like all of a sudden thrusting her into like, okay, we're going to do 6 different things, but it's slowly. And I know, Susan, like, can you talk a little bit about when you started working with Alia? like, what was your approach to helping her kind of get back to where she is now? Like, was it a very slow progression? Did you just dive right in? Like, what did that look like?
Well, it sort of had to be a slow thing because she was not very responsive when I first started going there. So, you know, both Adrienne and I would sort of have to poke her sometimes and be like, Alia, hi. Right? And she would sort of maybe like look at me for a couple seconds, and then you could see her going back into her dream world. So it was really, I think the first thing was probably Uno. That was the only kind of thing that
magic of Uno.
The magic of Uno. It is very magical. But one of the things that that this Ellie Summer recommends for he actually has a really clear kind of treatment plan for people who are engaging in too much maladaptive daydreaming. But one of the things I really like that he says is that it's basically you have to find things that are incompatible with the daydreaming. So if I, for example, like you were saying earlier, Adrienne, about the music, that can actually be a trigger. So she can still listen to music and daydream at the same time. So you need to find things that she cannot do at the same time as daydreaming. So something like playing a game, being interactive, having a conversation, giggling about farts, right? Like anything that we can do that basically doesn't allow her to daydream at the same time will keep her more engaged.
So it has to be like cognitively challenging enough that you have to focus on it.
And there can't be automaticity to it.
Right.
So for Alia, because she's really good at drawing and art, right, that was something she would willingly do, but you could see that she was still, a lot of the time when I would do that with her, she was still enmeshed in the fantasy world.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, right? If anybody else, you know, who likes art, you can let your mind wander when you're drawing and painting, and even when walking, right? You can kind of let your mind go listening to music. That's why people do those things, right?
That's right. They're a bit meditative. Yeah, and that's another thing that I've seen a few times that's recommended for people who are a bit too, that go down this route into fantasy world too much, is to do some mindfulness activities. But the problem with mindfulness activities, especially for our guys, is it's so, it's so abstract, right?
Yeah.
Just focus on your breathing. Well, I mean, if I tell Alia to focus on her breathing, she's just going to be like, okay, I'm going to go visit Elijah now, right? Like, great, Susan's given me 5 minutes to go visit my handsome guy in my fantasy world. Perfect. We can close our eyes and I'm going to go there. So, but if we do mindfulness activities that are more structured with maybe a visual component, like something like, you know, using like a mental vacation type thing, right? Where we have a photo of like a beach. She wanted like hot guys on the beach. So I found a picture of, you know, like a beach with hot guys on it.
Maybe a margarita.
Maybe a margarita.
Yeah.
And we did talk about the margaritas. That is, and then we talk about, you know, what are all the good things about the beach, right? Like what do you taste and what do you smell and what do you see? And that kind of thing can be good because it kind of keeps her with me more in a more real, like in more the real world. Or like a 5 senses activity where you know, that can kind of, I've noticed a couple of times that can draw her out of it. Like you seem to be slipping into that world. Now let's try, you know, let's look around the room and say 3 things we can see, say 3 things we can hear, say 3 things we can smell, right? And that gets her back. That's a mindfulness activity. But it gets her back to being with me, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I can imagine right now that families who are listening to this and who have children or teens or young adults who do this some of the time. So we hear this a lot about families who have high schoolers. And it's like, oh, by the time afternoon comes around, they are checked out and they're reenacting something from some movie. So it's not taking their entire day, but they might be worried hearing something like this. So what can people do to put the brakes on that or find some balance to prevent this really catastrophic thing from happening?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say, and I'm sure Adrienne has ideas too, because she's had really good, you know, ways of drawing Alia. back. But I would say, there's a couple of ways to do it. One is to make sure that the person, I like to think of it, I read once, I can't remember where, but I read once that we all need to have activities in which we can have both pleasure and or mastery. So essentially, you need to have things that are fun for you in your life, and you need to have things that you're good at, right? And that you can actually help build your self-confidence. So making sure that kids are doing those kinds of things, ensuring that the teens and adults have meaningful friendships, right? Not just, Alia does have this one friend, which is really great. And you don't need to have lots of friends, but you need to have at least one really meaningful friendship where there's a good amount of give and take at the same level with the other person. And I feel like we say this all the time. I think I've said it on this podcast before, but the screen time, right? So, but let me be a bit more specific about limiting screen time. So not only do you want to limit the actual amount of time, but it's also in terms of the fantasy world stuff, it's about not watching the same thing over and over. So I get really concerned when I hear parents saying, oh, they only like to watch Frozen or they only like to watch, I don't know, whatever other movie is, du jour, right?
Encanto, I think it is right now.
Encanto right now. If a teenager is watching Encanto, 3 times in a row on a Saturday, that's a problem, right? If that teenager is then able to kind of script from that movie or rehearse or say, line after line after line after line, that means they're watching it too much, right? That's definitely too much. And then the other thing I think that's really important about screen time that affects the fantasy world issue is the type of thing that you're watching. So things that are violent, things that are scary, and things that are overly dramatic should all be avoided for kids who tend to head down that path, right? Because it just gets, the reenactments then get really, they can bleed into real life. Right? We've seen that here at DSRF many times. So just keeping an eye on that. And I know it's much easier said than done, but it's really important.
And it's tricky too, because our guys are routine and they like the same thing. So it's like, oh, Frozen over and over again, because that's what I like. It's predictable. I know how it's going to turn out. I know every scene. And we've seen that. It's amazing how they can recount each scene of a movie. Even if I have clients where they like to listen to similar songs all the time, right? So it's like that. They won't like it, but you can break them out of that. But it's just good to keep in mind before you even introduce things like movies and, things that are either, like overly dramatic or whatever, to just make sure ahead of time you're like, okay, we're going to do a nature documentary today. Okay, we're going to do this today. So you're already providing them with variety so that they're not just stuck on that one thing, right? So, but
I'm really into these days watching like silly cats on YouTube. I find that really entertaining.
Allie enjoys that too.
We've watched those videos together. They're very hilarious.
Can I ask you a question, or going back earlier to when you were talking about providing, like with Alia, you were providing her with activities to do that like as we OTs like to call it, like just the right cognitive challenge. Talk a little bit about the importance of interaction, like having somebody else there to interact with you so that you're hopefully less likely to retreat into your fantasy world. Because obviously with the pandemic, all of your friendships are, you're not seeing your friends anymore. You're not seeing your siblings' friends anymore. So that piece of having friendships and having that social connection and how that plays into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's crucial, right? It's it needs to happen for sure. And I think actually one thing that people can do is even if a child or a teen or an adult is getting too much into their fantasy world, it can help you connect with them if you actually go in with them, right? So like, Allie and I and other kids I've worked with too, and adults, we talk about what happens in that world, right? And she wasn't into that for a long time.
Yeah.
She didn't really want to
share.
that. No, she did not want to share. But what worked for her is I got her writing about it, and then we would kind of talk about it a little bit, because she really, likes the writing kinds of tasks. So if you're having trouble getting your teen or adult to engage with you, that might be one way to do it, right? But it is really important that they have meaningful relationships. I mean, just think about how all of us felt during the early stages of the pandemic when social opportunities were really limited. It doesn't make you feel good. So it's crucial.
I try to set up those opportunities for Alia as much as I can, because obviously spending time with me gets a little bit boring, and she needs.
I don't know, you're pretty fun.
She needs some more stimulation
I want to hang out. Yeah.
than her mother. So, for example, and she doesn't like to initiate. So I would ask. My son Noah or Lachlan or Leanna or whoever it is there to ask her to do something. So if I said, Alia, do you want to play ping pong? She'd be like, no. And I'm like, well, Lachlan is asking you to play. Oh, really? And he's like a cute Australian guy. And then it's like, okay, I'll play with Lachlan. Yeah. And same with Uno. She'll play Uno if her Nona, her grandmother, asked her to play. She'll do that. Or if her brother's been playing with her quite a bit, playing Uno, and as a family, she's very good at it, mostly because she cheats. But she definitely gets some positive feedback because she's very successful. So maybe she's mastered Uno. So that's her one thing that she's mastered.
And art.
And
she's really great
art.
at art.
The screen time is an interesting one, because when I reflect back on what she was doing prior to COVID, she was very interested in the Vampire Diaries and the origins. And I'm thinking violent, dramatic. And what was the other one?
Scary.
Yeah. Check. And she would watch it over and over.
Yeah.
But not with me. With her dad, she would watch The Voice, and she loved that. So I think that's a pretty safe one.
Yeah. Yeah. We have that on our list of approved activities. And with me, she would watch Heartland. And a funny story about Heartland. Well, not funny, but ironic, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word. But I had finally convinced her to watch Heartland, which is one of her favorite shows. It's a Canadian show about horses and handsome cowboys, and it's just lovely grandfathers and all this kind of stuff. And I had finally got her to agree to watch at least part of an episode of Heartland with me. And we sat down, we started watching it. And the first thing that happens on this particular episode is the guy, her favorite character, dies. And is no longer on any episodes of, and I did not check beforehand. So that was a major Adrienne fail. And we've since gone back and watched the rest of the episodes, and I think she's forgiven me for tie-dyeing, because I'm sure that was my fault. But so that's an interesting thing about screen time, is that she hasn't been wanting to engage in it, I think, because right now it interferes with her ideas, because she changed the story. But when she goes to a movie, that's entirely different, because she's so, except for Dune, don't recommend Dune for people who
Dune's a bit too slow for our guys. It's a beautiful movie, but not for our guys.
It is, but it didn't catch her attention. So she's fully engaged in movies when she goes to see them, because it's an adventure. You're going out, you're having popcorn, you're having apparently multiple margaritas, and she she's engaged in the show, so she's not dreaming at the same time. So it's one of those things that she can't do at the same time.
It's so novel. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think part of the reason, and we've talked about this in another episode, but part of the reason that our students and adults are so attracted to this kind of TV is because they're so good at reading emotions.
Yeah.
Like, it's actually a huge area of strength. They're very sensitive overall to these close-up shots of big emotions and feelings and violence and those
they
kind
eat
of
it
things.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets tangled.
And the issue is, and this didn't just happen with Alia, but with other teens and adults I've worked with this similar, going into Fantasyland issue, is that when you see the violence and the scary, and that will filter into their fantasy. And so there were times for sure that Alia seemed scared of what was happening. I've definitely seen that. I've seen kids be very upset about what's happening, so crying because of something that's happened in their fantasy world. So you just, you don't want to fuel that, basically. Yeah. But it's also hard to find shows that don't have those
and
things,
that are also
right?
like age appropriate, right? We also spend a lot of time encouraging people to watch more mature things. I guess it's nature documentaries forever. Which are my favorite.
Really is.
So
It's
that's
that or The Voice.
The Voice, nature documentaries, and that's
Dancing
it.
with the Stars.
Sure.
That these like reality shows that are like not fantasy.
Heartland's okay.
Heartland's okay, except for that one episode.
And
We
that
should put
one
a parent
episode.
alert on that episode.
Yeah, if I had been alerted to that fact, it might have been better because I could have prepared her.
But it's great that she came back to it.
That's she did, because she's now getting better and able to, and we can enjoy the horses and the beautiful scenery and all the
other things to kind of And I was just gonna say that it's nice when you're watching these things with your kids to also have conversations about it, right? Like, oh, this isn't really real. This is just pretend. So just kind of starting that dialogue.
That's right. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because I think if you do, and you said, Alia won't let me watch it with her, and in fact, that's a lot of the times what happens. But if you can kind of force yourself in there as a parent. So, I have a couple of dudes who really, for some reason, like Days of Our Lives, right? And if parents watch it with them and they talk about that's not really what happens, that people don't slap each other like that, families don't hit each other. Well, maybe some families do, but you know what I mean. That if you can kind of get it grounded back in reality. So that was fun to watch, but it's not real. That's not really what happens. Let's kind of talk about that a bit more. Let's
families have to make it less fun. They have to make it a little less fun,
attractive, which when I have recommended that to parents, the kids get real mad about it
because it's taking out the fun.
Because it's not, I can't go down that path anymore, right? So, but it's really important to do it.
I watched quite a few episodes of the Vampire Diaries and a bit of the originals just so I knew what she was talking about, so I can. Especially at the beginning, so I could engage in conversation. I think those were wasted hours. So I would say things to her that would make her really mad, which would be like, Elijah's not that cute. That was just like,
that's going too far.
It's going too far.
Well, and we had to talk about how old he is, right? And how that was one of the things, like he's way too old for you. He's like 40
the same
something.
age as her Auntie Meredith.
Right. You can't.
And when I say that and she thinks of her Auntie M, she calls her, she's like, ooh. And then Susan did this wonderful list, which I was alluding to before, about the relationships. What do you have to have a successful relationship? So it was, is the person interested in similar things to you? Is the person available? Real. Is the person married? Is the person living in the same town? Is the person and then the last one, just like you said, is the person actually real? And so
abstract.
We figured that the actor is real. And I've suggested writing, because I want her to get writing again, fan mail. Because that's something that that people do, write a fan letter.
And that's acknowledging him as a person.
As a real
not
person,
character.
So I've tried that. She hasn't, I said I would write it for her. I offered many times to write her story for her. Like she's changed the plot of the ending of the Vampire Diaries. So I have offered to write it for her. And she said, no, it's still private. So not successful there. But she shares a bit more. One of the things I wanted to mention is that there is very, very little information, and maybe you found more than I did, but of maladaptive daydreaming disorder and Down syndrome or any other disability.
That goes with pretty much everything.
Is that right? Yeah.
Every mental health, and that one's not even, as we said, it's not even officially a diagnosis yet. But that is true of almost all of them. I mean, there's like little bits here and there about how they interact together, but it's pretty rare.
Yeah, they did mention it very often coincides with ADHD, OCD, sometimes autism, but mostly ADHD. And there's some kind of differential test that you can do to see if it's
which of the
which it is. But having said that, I did find it very valuable to go on. There's a Facebook group for people with maladaptive daydreaming disorder, and it's them talking to each other. And I found that really helpful because there's a lot about, do you ever fantasize about celebrities or how much of your, like it's really, I got a lot of insight. And they're all typical. A lot of them have had major incidents in their lives that they're trying to avoid. But I did find that useful looking at that because there is so little in.
Yeah. Well, it
available.
leads perfectly into my next question, which was as a parent, and then I'll come to Susan as a professional, but as a parent, if there's somebody listening out there being like, oh, sounds a lot like my kid, what would you recommend like their course of action be? So now that they're familiar with the term maladaptive daydreaming, read up on it. We'll put links to some of these things on our episode page, but from a parent's perspective, how would you guide another parent into navigating this?
So Ellie Summer has created I think it's a scale. So you can go through that to see if, you tick the boxes of MD, they call it. And then I think sometimes like with Alia, she did need, I believe, the antipsychotic to just kind of get her out of it. And then also the whatever would help her to sleep. Sleep was really important. If she chose daydreaming over sleep, she was so messed up. So messed up. And so just getting her on a sleep schedule, we actually did a sleep test, like the apnea test. She was fine. So getting her on a regular sleep schedule, which involved lorazepam in larger to less dosage. Now she's not even on it at all. And her sleep schedule is really good. So sometimes some of these things are just temporary measures. And then, so that's a psychiatrist getting involved. Wouldn't expect too much from your family doctor. You really, I know I always say this, but you have to advocate and you know your kid best. And you kind of have that instinct of what do they like and what will get them out of their, it's not a funk because they think it's awesome. Like
it's part of what makes it so hard.
Vivid imagery and you can just sense that they're so immersed in it, and the pull and the compulsion is so extreme that it must be awesome to be in that daydream. So to try to compete with that is really challenging, but it's not impossible. And so just bit by bit, medication usually helps, and then introducing things slowly so it's not overwhelming. So they're not bored and they're doing things that they can't daydream at the same time. Try playing ping pong and daydreaming at the same time.
Yeah.
It's very different.
Yeah.
And daydreaming and fantasy is totally different than mind wandering and imagination. It's like a full on immersion into something impossible or at least improbable. So it's really different than just your thoughts are wandering to, certain things. We all do that. So,
And Susan, what are, from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I just want to give Adrienne some credit too, because like it was dark times in your house for a while. And I think what really helped you guys is you really, and this is hard to do, but you really maintained a positive attitude. You never really, you didn't sort of, you kept trying, right? You had to put a lot of effort in, as you say, to get Alia to pull her out.
Yeah.
But you kept trying things, like basically anything you could, right? And I just want to give you some credit for that, because I'm sure that can't have been easy to do. And I think just in terms of, I had a couple thoughts about definitely finding a psychiatrist for sure, just to, as we've talked about, finding an actual diagnosis is not necessarily the route you need to go down, but sometimes these medications can be helpful. It helps you get over that initial hurdle so that some of the behavioral or counseling stuff works a bit better, right? So it doesn't mean the person has to be on medication forever and ever. You can eventually decrease them, but I think that can be important, and if it's quite a severe issue. So a psychiatrist for sure, and then if you can find a counselor or a psychologist who has some experience with people with developmental disabilities and or Down syndrome, right? That would be great. I know there are not a lot of us out there, but there are some of us for sure. And then I did want to just talk about, just because it popped into my head, about that I think there's an important point with the maladaptive daydreaming that is, when you were saying earlier, Adrienne, that there's not a lot of, research on how the two interact together. And I think from what I can tell so far, there are a couple of key differences for sure. One is that they will say in that literature that people who are engaged, typically developing people who are engaging in the maladaptive daydreaming, can easily distinguish fantasy from reality. And I don't think that's always the case. I think in Alia's case, it mostly was. From what I saw, she could say, like she would say to you, "I know it's pretend, Mom." Or,
she said that from day one.
Yeah, so she could distinguish, but I think sometimes kids can't. Some of the other teens and adults I've worked with, it's harder to tease those two apart, right?
And she said that, but it could have been because she knew that's what
you wanted to hear.
I wanted to hear.
Yeah. So that, that could have been part of it too. And then the other thing is to keep in mind the motivation component. So as, Adrienne said, it's such a pull, it's such a draw. If you are a typically developing person, you can rationalize around that. You can you're distressed by it because you're like, wow, this is really fun being this fantasy world, but I know I need to work. I know I need to take care of my kids. I know that I need to be around my family, right? And so you can make yourself get out of it. That does not exist necessarily for people with Down syndrome, right? They're like, nope, it's more fun there.
Yeah.
I'm having a really good time. The real world is okay, I guess, but why would I want to be there when I can be over here?
Where I have
and
more
so
control,
the motivation component, I think, is really a huge issue, right? It's not just a matter of, rationalizing that I need to be spending more time in the real world because that's what I'm supposed to do, right?
Yeah, a lot of the literature talks about the typical person with maladaptive daydreaming disorder, they will feel guilt and shame after they've engaged in that behavior because it might have gone on too long, it might have been excessive, whatever. They feel guilt and shame because they think that they should be engaging in other behaviors. Whereas Alia does not have any of that. She
No.
just thinks that, you know, this was a better option at this time. You know, that was a good decision from my point of view.
Yeah.
So it's very, I agree. It's very different from there. The other thing that, when you talked about, our approach, our family's approach, the positive approach, I mean, there were many, many tears shed, not in front of Alia, but because it was so heartbreaking and I just wanted my daughter back. But one of the keys that really helped was just not judging it. And it's not only being positive, but not like she was experiencing it for whatever reason. It was what she was going through. And it was really frustrating for a lot of people around her because there was irritating noises, there was irritating behaviors, there was repetitive things, there was non-communication, and it was really, really difficult to be around. So when we did have family gatherings, some of the cousins were just like very, I don't know if triggered is the right word, but just like, why is she doing that over and over again? And I'm just like, this is where Allie is right now. She's, and trying to explain it was really tough, but not judging her behaviors, but just trying to understand and move forward with, and realize that there's going to be some days, like Roger said today, we've been on a 5-day roll of really positive behavior. We went to the P&E, we went to Theater Under the Stars, and today was a really good day. And she saw her friend Taya last night and had 2 margaritas.
Yeah, she told me she was hungover this morning.
There's a theme.
Since you brought it up.
There's a theme. Yeah, she texted her, like she doesn't text and communicate very much, but she texted both me and Roger separately saying, "I'm drunk." Like, what are you going to do with that? I'm like, good for you. Just, yeah, whatever. And her friend is totally great and just, you know.
Yeah.
They had their meal and she came home. So.
Like any other 20-some-year-old.
Yeah.
It's perfect.
Why would it be any different? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's also really important to kind of let our listeners know that it doesn't mean that any kind of, I mean, pandemic was just so different, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if you have a death in the family that this will happen. It's just something to be aware of.
Yeah.
Or especially, we talked about this in another episode, how a lot of our guys have trouble when the big post-high school transition happens, right? So you're kind of preparing ahead of time and not necessarily thinking worst case scenario, but just being like, oh, just going to keep an eye on things because as soon as high school is finished, support systems are going to be different or gone, right? All those extracurricular activities are going to be gone. So these type of things might be more likely to happen. So it's just not to scare families, but to prepare families that just have this as an additional tool. So you'll know what to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If I had realized that this was going to become an issue, I would have accessed way more help from CLBC much earlier. And the psychiatrist there's a huge waiting list.
Yeah.
And honestly, it wasn't until the psychiatric nurse came to our house and witnessed it that we got in the next week.
Yeah.
Because she, you know, you say it over the phone, it doesn't sound so bad, but when you see it, it's especially if you've
seen her before,
and they had come, you know, 4 or 5 times and seen her go down, and get further immersed into it. And it was at that point that I know that's why we got the appointment. It was so.
Yeah. You were on the ready.
Yeah. So maybe even things around like if this is happening, some of the time letting your family doctor know, not that the family doctor is going to be the end of the line of this inquiry, but just so that it can happen at an expedited process if it needs to later.
Yeah. Keep a record of it too, right? I think
we love baseline video.
Yeah.
Of somebody doing really well.
Yeah.
always good to keep around. And then
for many reasons.
Many
That's such a valid
Yeah.
tool to have. I wish I had more. Like we've had videos of Alia, but if I had focused on that before, so they could see the before and after, because people who don't know your child has
and
no
people
idea
make
how
bad
she was
assumptions.
functioning
Exactly.
before. And they make assumptions. Oh, this is just Down syndrome.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
And
Oh yeah.
it's
They
not.
do. And to what you were saying, Hannah, around even transitioning into high school, which has a different structure than elementary school. And for a lot of our students, it involves too much downtime in the school day.
Yes.
So they do a lot of fantasy during the day, but thinking less about finding the most challenging thing for your student and more about the most engaging and successful thing for your high school student and post high school as well. So that time is full and meaningful and people feel good about what they're doing.
Uno, it's the answer to everything. Uno.
Well, I didn't know Alia before, so I don't know anything about her, but I can imagine many other students who had too much like hang time and they were just they were struggling with it.
And we've seen this so many times with our families and our caseloads where we talk to the teachers and the EAs and it's like, we're just hanging around
out.
doing this, or, they're in high school,
hanging
they're in
around.
access class, they're just doing this. And it's just a recipe for trouble. So it's like
is.
those meaningful, and forgive the term because I'm an OT, but those meaningful occupations are really important. They need to engage in things that are meaningful for them every day so that, that they find fun and love in what they're doing. So I'm so happy you brought that up. It's a really great point. We want to thank you both so much for sharing, definitely with you, Adrienne, for sharing your story. I know it must have been a very tough time. We can't imagine, but we're so happy to see Alia kind of come back to where she was. I remember her when she was younger too. So it's just so great to see her doing the talent show and that lovely dance that she did a couple of
You mean the
weeks ago.
twerking?
The
that
twerking.
apparently she
is a
learned from her
masterful-
mother.
Yeah, apparently she learned
Just another Tuesday night, Roger says.
Just had to throw that in there.
I had a chance to take Alia's photo for a Raise Me Up project, and it was just so much fun interacting with her. She was just so confident, so it was so great to see. But thank you so much for sharing your story. I know this is going to be very helpful for professionals listening, for families listening, and anyone else. And thank you, Susan, for sharing your expertise as well. We'll put links to all those things to Dr. Ellie Summer and everyone else's, Dr. McGuire, all that on our episode page. But
And if anybody has any questions for me, any parents want to,
fantastic.
absolutely, they can
Awesome.
email me.
Okay, great.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We'll put those on there too.
Yeah, and thanks for having me. It
thank you so much.
Kind of makes it seem a little bit more legitimate, because it's like
absolutely.
Susan said, it's not on the DSM. So I think it will be. There's more research happening. And
I think it will be.
I think the pandemic, it's caused so many challenges for our guys, but in a way it's like, okay, now at least people are paying attention to it.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, now we just got to keep pushing forward, right? Making sure we're all aware of it. So, but thank you so much.
You're very welcome.